Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a graphic novel that I read. I am back on that graphic novel grind, and I want to talk about a graphic novel that focuses on a swamp creature as well as highlighting fears and some past misdeeds by America in general, which is interesting. I am referring to Alan Moore's The Saga of the Swamp Thing, Volume 3, with art by Stephen Bissett and John Totleben, among multiple other authors. And this was published in 1985. My journey through Swamp Thing has been part of a booktube challenge by Lucas over at the Bits of Lit. I will make sure to put a link in the description to Lucas's video for this month. And these challenges are going to continue on until February, it seems, as we need to get through all the entire series, and I believe there's 6 volumes. And I just want to say that I think this volume really sold me on the series as a whole. Volume 1 and 2 were pretty good, but Volume 3 was really knocked out of the park by both the artist as well as Alan Moore, who just puts all of his work into this. And you really see shades of some of his other work, like V for Vendetta and Watchmen here as well. And so, I've already talked about Alan Moore, so I don't need to go too in depth into his work. But he does do a lot of commentary on fascism and the nature of superheroes themselves, and talks about and does a lot of character work, and you see all of that here. I think exploring who Swamp Thing is, what he represents, and what type of enemies that he's facing, given that he is a hero of nature and the swamps. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the analysis section. So without further ado, let's talk about the Saga of the Swamp Thing, Volume 3. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Volume 3 of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing begins by focusing on a character that children teasingly call Nuke Face, as he looks pretty hideous and he appears to be falling apart. He is walking around with somebody named Ed, who seems to not be doing very well. And Nukeface is drinking cans of what we learn are nuclear fallout or nuclear waste material. He's a bit upset because he's been told not to drink it, and he believes that as an American, it's his right to do whatever he wants. Just a really terrible character. And we see that he touches Ed, and Ed sort of decays before our eyes, indicating that Nukeface is radioactive and dangerous, and a threat to many different people. At the same time, Swamp Thing is with Abby, sort of leaving off where Volume 2, or starting where Volume 2 had left off, with them now having a relationship. It appears that Swamp Thing foresees doom, a coming doom. We don't know exactly what is going to cause this. But Nukeface encounters Swamp Thing and starts calling him Ed, indicating that he's clearly delusional, and also just pointing out that nuclear weapons are pretty wonderful and being the worst parts of America. And Swamp Thing is terrified of him, and when Nukeface touches him, Swamp Thing begins to decay, and he realizes that he's going to die, and Nukeface wanders off elsewhere. Eventually, Abby stumbles upon him, and Swamp Thing is like, I'm going to die, but I'm going to try to replant my body elsewhere so that I can come back to life. Please, if this is our last talk, I love you, Abby. And at that point, he actually dies. We also learn about Wallace Monroe and his wife, who encounter Nukeface. Monroe, in particular, or Monroe's wife, is pregnant, and she encounters Nukeface, and this drives her husband to sadness because maybe something terrible was done to the baby that she's carrying because she came into contact with a radiated man and whatnot. But we never find out quite what happened to them. Maybe we will in a later volume. We later see Swamp Thing reforming, becoming larger and larger as time progresses, Abby encountering him and helping to stimulate his growth. We also see an introduction to John Constantine, a character who is just being introduced to DC Comics at this time. He's searching for an answer as to what doom is being foretold, something satanic in nature, and he's also looking for Swamp Thing, who he eventually finds and tells that he has great powers that he's only starting to discover, and Swamp Thing wants to learn more about this. We see some kids at a lake, and there's vampires underneath the water, and they end up getting one of the children. We also hear about the mother who is laying eggs that will hatch into vampires, and maybe those vampires will take over the world if they're allowed to. This takes place in Rosewood, a place where Swamp Thing has already been, and he caused a dam to collapse, which should have killed the vampires, but they hid away, and once the waters became still, they sat underneath the water and waited for their chance to grow. Swamp Thing enables himself to regrow again by killing himself off and growing elsewhere, showing that he's slowly mastering this ability. And he takes on the Rosewood vampires underneath the water, eventually growing to encompass the entire water, causing earthquakes and whatnot. And he reforms in the river and is able to sufficiently destroy the vampires after setting the water back in motion, just wiping all the vampires out. We also see a story titled The Curse about a woman named Phoebe who, because of the rage that she feels towards men and the sexism and misogyny that she faces, she becomes a sort of metaphorical werewolf, a literal one, but also metaphorical for the situation that she's encountering. And Swamp Thing realizes that he can't stop her because this is her domain, and to stop her would be kind of wrong, and attacking the town, which is weird, but also he realizes that it's necessary to try to stop her. Eventually she decides that she doesn't want to deal with this misogyny anymore, so she just kills herself on some silverware, and Swamp Thing carries her out and sets her outside so she can die outside where she wants. And then there's another story where there's a bunch of actors filming a movie on an old plantation where terrible things happened, and the ghost of the plantation began to possess them and reenacting the terrible things that happened there. And Swamp Thing goes there and realizes that there's a terrible energy from there, and eventually he even burns down the mansion, which allows the ghost to be freed or something like that. And then as the story ends, we see one of the undead still wandering around, eventually getting a job at a ticket booth at a movie theater. And I'm sure that's meant to be funny, but I don't know if Alan Moore has more planned with that storyline down the road. And that's really where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, this is a really good volume. I'd say it's the volume that probably convinced me of Alan Moore's staying power with this series, because I'd always heard that it was good, but I don't think volume 1 or 2 fully convinced me, but this one definitely did. It might even be a late contender for one of my top 10 books of the year, just with how high quality it is, which should say something given all of the stories that I have lined up for that and for that honor, by the time, especially earlier in the year. So one of the things that Alan Moore talks about here is he continues to talk about identity. If you watched my first 2 videos about volume 1 and 2, you know that Alan Moore has been talking and working with the theme of identity, calling into question who Swamp Thing even is. Is he Alec Holland? Alec Holland's body is somewhere else. And even further than that, Alec Holland apparently went to heaven and passed through to paradise. So what is Swamp Thing? It seems like he's kind of his own entity at this point, with somehow still having the memories of Alec Holland, which creates another philosophical question right there. But in this story, we see that Swamp Thing dies after being touched by Nukeface, and he regrows a new body somewhere else. So this is very interesting because not only is the memory of Alec Holland gone, because Swamp Thing willed himself to forget that in the past 2 volumes, but the body that he got from the biorestorative formula is gone as well, killed off by Nukeface. And then several times throughout the story, Swamp Thing grows a new body, and so he's pretty far away removed from Alec Holland. You'd have to question whether he is even Alec Holland anymore. What is the trace of Alec Holland? And one of those traces is Abby, who still insists on calling him Alec, even though he's not really Alec. And Abby doesn't even know Alec Holland. I think she met Swamp Thing after he turned into Swamp Thing. So she's just calling him that because that's an easy thing to call him. She could call him Swamp Thing, but that seems like a weird derogatory kind of term if you think about it. So Abby still calls him that, but it's sort of a shorthand kind of thing. So there's the question of who is Swamp Thing, and why? Where does the line between Swamp Thing start and Alec Holland continue onwards? And it seems like they're separate, but they're not quite separate. And to make things even more complicated, as Swamp Thing burns down the mansion of the racism story, he has a memory of Alec Holland burning when he died. And so why would he still have that memory if he's not truly Alec Holland? It calls into question a lot of things, and I like that that Alan Moore is trying to blur the lines and get us to ask these questions, because they're very important questions to ask. How do you determine who you are? Is it your body? Is it your memories? Is it who you think you are? A lot of interesting questions that not a lot of graphic novels or even comic books really try to ask. And what you end up with is a ship of Theseus scenario where the original sort of Alec Holland has been replaced by these new parts. And is it even the ship of Theseus or the ship of Alec anymore? Because in the story of the ship of Theseus, you have a ship that's replaced by new parts, and eventually all of the old parts are somewhere else. So what is the Alec Holland of the scenario? Is it the Alec Holland who went to heaven? Is it the Alec Holland who has the memories of him? Is Swamp Thing something else entirely? I'm leaning towards something else entirely, but Alan Moore is asking a lot of questions here that make it difficult to really know for sure. And another very interesting thing that Alan Moore is talking about that I did not expect him to talk about in this volume, or really in this series, is America's sentence. He's really sort of using Swamp Thing as a way to reflect on the current problems that America and really the world are facing in 1985, and which continue to this day because of some of the ideas that he's talking about. You see him talking about the nuclear crisis and nuclear waste and all of those worries, because Chernobyl would be fresh in America's mind, as well as 3 Mile Island and other issues. And he's using that by introducing the character of Nukeface, who is dead set on being an American and drinking nuclear waste and causing problems for the environment, which was what all these nuclear scares were doing at the time, realizing that all this nuclear waste was going to have a disastrous effect on the environment and a lot of populations, because it might have radiated people and affected births and even lifespans in general. And it's really interesting that Nukeface looks like a Reagan politician. He's really reflective of Reagan's America, someone who believes that America is right, and that we can do whatever we want, and that children are awful people who should not be ridiculing him. And he looks like a Reagan era politician, as I might have said. But it's really interesting. You might say that Alan Moore is British. What is he complaining about Reagan for? And to that I say, you can complain about Reagan from anywhere because his foreign policy was long-reaching. But also, at this time, Britain was led by Margaret Thatcher, of all people, and she was a Reagan-esque politician who a lot of people in Britain considered to be one of the worst politicians who ever led the country. And in general, she's every bit as bad as Ronald Reagan, in my opinion. So he's using this as a way to talk about Reagan, Thatcher, the environment, and nuclear energy in general. And then in the story of the curse with the woman who turns into the werewolf, he's talking about feminism and misogyny in America. How the woman is literally, because of this misogyny, she is turning into a werewolf, which allows her to sort of express all the things that lay hidden, ultimately realizing that she's causing destruction. And so she's kind of cursed to not be able, she's cursed like she has to enact it this way, but she doesn't have any power, so she can't be effective in how she's enacting this violence upon the world. Like, she can kill her husband, but at the end of the day, like, she's still like in this system of misogyny. And this would be a very interesting message to get across, but unfortunately, this is written in the same issue where Abby Arcane exists, and Abby Arcane is written in the most sexual possible way, just hanging all over Swamp Thing. And you can't say in one voice, oh, women are treated poorly in America, and then also depict a character that is highly sexualized, and like, is this all women are good for? She's only interested in a relationship or something like that. So I feel like the message is contradicted in a way that hurts what Alan Moore is trying to say here. And if Abby's depiction was better or more positive overall, maybe the message would have come across pretty effectively. But this is stuff that still should be said, and I thank Alan Moore for saying it. And then the last story about the racist roots and the plantation and all of that, I find very interesting because it's covering like America's sin of not addressing the problems of racism. Like, sure, we ended slavery, but that didn't stop racism from existing. Jim Crow and segregation and all of those problems were allowed to thrive. And what's really interesting is that Swamp Thing notes like like a bird dies and he feeds himself, like he feeds the energy of the bird, and the bird is allowed to decay as a result. But he questions when he gets to the mansion, like, were the spirits allowed to decay? Were we allowed to address the elephant in the room, slavery, and allow us to heal from that wound that happened? And I think Swamp Thing argues that no, we probably weren't. And as a result, these ghosts of our past are still fresh. There's an interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. I feel something in the land here, difficult to describe, as if a pattern has been etched upon this place by emotions so fierce and caustic that they burned their imprint into the soil itself. And even though its design is long since buried, it still guides the footsteps of those who tread the world above. And that's a really fascinating quote, because Swamp Thing is getting at like that slavery and racism has been so ingrained in society that we try to bury it and pretend it doesn't exist. You know, we live in a post-racial America under Obama, or we got rid of segregation a while back, as the Reagan administration would say, but it's still there. If you bury it, that just makes it even worse, because then people can just say, oh, like, we're not racist, we just think X, Y, or Z, we're just economically concerned or stuff like that. And Swamp Thing is pointing out, that we have to properly address it in order for this country to heal, which feels like a weird thing for a swamp creature to say, but it really works here because of Alan Moore's deft writing and for his passion and sincerity in the matter. Like, this is a genuine problem, and we haven't addressed it, and it's going to continue to haunt us well into the future. Kind of like what Louise Erdrich was saying in the sentence, but I think probably a little bit more effectively here. There are a number of other great elements of the story, including the horror that I think is pretty wonderful, with the idea of Nuke Face being this radioactive monster, with the vampires in the story lying underneath the surface. I thought that was pretty good, and the ghost of the past coming up to to rise up and demand their freedom. I think Alan Moore does a really good job of writing horror, and I'd love to read more of his horror down the road just to get a feel for that. And also the art, which is pretty good. I particularly like all the close-ups of Swamp Thing's face and his regrowth as he becomes larger. It's kind of funny at times, as evidenced by Lucas's new Twitter avatar, where it just looks like a weird baby Swamp Thing. I think the art is worth noting. And then also the introduction of Constantine is pretty cool, which would lay the groundwork for interesting supernatural stories in Vertigo and DC Comics. And also a pretty wonderful Keanu Reeves movie down the road. But there's a number of problems as well. It feels like Swamp Thing is too powerful. If he can just regrow and regenerate, what's the obstacle? What's the danger for Swamp Thing? He feels a little too invincible. Like the only threat to him is whoever threatens Abby, and then it turns out that Abby's used as an object more so than anything else. So that's worth noting, and I think that does hinder this story a little bit. And then Nuke Face, like he seemed like he was going to be like the main threat of this volume, but he just dies away quickly, which kind of sucks given how like interesting he was as a villain. I do think Alan Moore could have done a little bit more to flesh him out and make him more of a threat throughout his run in this series. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Volume 3 of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run. A pretty great volume, one of the best graphic novels that I've read in recent times, and I think it makes it. I think it makes the entire series worth pursuing just so you can get to Volume 3 thus far. We'll see if they keep up the energy and the writing quality through 4, 5, and 6, but I have no doubt that Alan Moore can do such things. If you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about Volume 3. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this series if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and sinful American travels. Farewell.